After World War II, a devastated Europe was up for grabs between the United States and Soviet Union, between capitalism and communism. In 1948, after years of tough debate and diplomacy, American President Harry Truman signed the Marshall Plan into law. While it was criticized by some for excluding Eastern Europe and for being based on ulterior motives, it provided over $13 billion in aid to Western Europe. The plan was a great success, allowing a full renaissance to occur in Western Europe and laying the foundation for a unified Europe, though it added much intensity to the Cold War. The defeat of the Axis powers in World War II raised hopes that the world would return to peace and harmony. However, much more conflict was at hand. The war devastated Europe, destroying 75 million lives and leaving major cities in ruins. Strikes, unrest, and harsh winters only exacerbated the situation. In addition, Europe was already being split in the middle. One side under Soviet control, one side not. This tearing of Europe was evident at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, attended by Soviet, American, and British leaders to discuss post-war Europe. Though all three men agreed to promote democracy, Stalin impelled his counterparts to recognize a Soviet sphere of influence on Eastern Europe. American President Harry Truman believed, however, that democratic elections in Europe were still feasible because of the US's economic and military power. Unfortunately, diplomacy didn't work, and by 1946, the Grand Alliance of Britain, the US, and the USSR had fallen apart. The US and Western Europe came to see the Soviets as imperialists, even though they wanted a buffer zone to prevent future invasion. George Kennan, the US's Soviet policy advisor, advocated a strategy of containment in his famous Long Telegram. On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill announced that an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe, showing the US and its allies that the Soviets could take advantage of the war-torn world. They worked to contain communism, which had already spread to several parts of Europe. On March 12, 1947, Truman appealed to Congress for $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. On June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced to Harvard's graduating class that the U.S. would aid any European country willing to cooperate in the European Recovery Program, the ERP, more commonly known as the Marshall Plan. Immediately, British and French foreign ministers scheduled a meeting between them and the USSR to organize the Marshall Plan. This conference, which started on June 27, 1947, was mired by American demands over European integration, which, to the Soviets, threatened their sphere of influence and violated national sovereignties. According to UCLA professor J.R. Getty, the price tag was too high for the Soviets. They would have been forced to buy American products and to open their accounts to U.S. accountants. Before the meeting ended, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had walked out, denouncing the plan. Undaunted, the foreign ministers convened the Conference of European Economic Cooperation in July to discuss the Marshall Plan. Notably absent were the Poles and Czechs, who had succumbed to pressure from Stalin. While the meeting began harmoniously, the debate soon turned sour when the representatives began discussing the details of the plan. In September of 1947, a report of the estimated cost of the Marshall Plan for the coming 4 years was released. In addition, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation was created to coordinate the European side of the plan. However, Democrats and Republicans alike in the U.S. Congress debated the purpose of the plan. Senator Robert Taft warned of overspending tax dollars, of burgeoning presidential power, and of foreign entanglements. Democrat Henry A. Wallace mockingly called the plan a Marshall Plan. However, through shrewd diplomacy, Arthur Vandenberg slowly gained congressional support. The Soviet-led coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948 added to public support, and after 4 months of debate and diplomacy, Truman signed into law the Marshall Plan on April 3, 1948. From 1948 to 1951, the Marshall Plan provided over $13 billion in aid to 18 Western European nations. Marshall Plan aid came in countless forms, ranging from much-needed food and seeds to crucial raw materials and machines. This aid impacted Europe from Reykjavik to Rome. Marshall Plan money helped provide immediate nutrition to malnourished Europeans during the food shortage, helped finance housing projects for displaced Easterners in Berlin, and helped build massive factories and dams throughout the continent. An economic miracle began on June 21, 1948, with the introduction of the Deutschmark in West Germany, a direct consequence of the Marshall Plan. The multifaceted aid quickly boosted Western Europe's economy and morale. As the Marshall Plan brought together Western Europe economically, military integration began to surface as well. Internation agreements culminated in the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on April 4, 1949. Though its proponents lauded the apparent effectiveness of the plan, its detractors pointed out possible ulterior motives. Historian Felix Green wrote that Marshall Plan aid was being used by the U.S. to reap profits and dominate European economies. While Western Europe went through its largest period of economic growth in history, Eastern Europe floundered.
The Soviet Union has a kind of a built-in paranoia about what's going on in the West, and it goes way back, decades in fact. The Soviet Union sees itself as the target of Western aggression, so that what the Marshall Plan is therefore is, another example of the soured relations and misperceptions on both sides.
As the Soviet Union began to realize the weakness of its Central European states, Stalin founded the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance in 1949 to bolster the Soviet economy, the same way the Marshall Plan did. Threatened by NATO, the USSR initiated the Warsaw Pact, a NATO-like mutual defense treaty within the Soviet bloc. However, the USSR's strict communistic regime, as well as the weakness of the bloc nations, hindered the usefulness of the pacts. Life in the Soviet bloc became so unbearable that many risked death to flee. Western integration gained a large boost on May 10, 1950, when French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, inspired by the European cooperation brought about by the Marshall Plan, issued his Schuman Declaration, which called for a true diplomacy-based European community. Lauded by many, including West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, Schuman's speech led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. This consequence of the Marshall Plan jump-started another wave of European collaboration and supranational diplomacy, as well as Western European rehabilitation. Older institutions like the International Monetary Fund gained momentum, while newer communities like the European Atomic Energy and European Economic Communities were created through Treaties of Rome in 1957. Political cooperation came about in 1986 with the Single European Act. Marshall Plan-influenced cooperation hit its zenith in 1992 with the Treaty of Maastricht, a treaty which created the supranational community desired by Schuman, the European Union. Economic integration that began with the Marshall Plan culminated in the 1999 creation of the Eurozone, now a 17-nation group committed to a common currency, the euro. The consequences of the plan are still felt today. Eastern Europe has yet to fully catch up economically with the West. Al Gore and Gordon Brown have cited the Marshall Plan as a paradigm for helping third world countries grow economically. The work of Paul Hoffman and Avril Harriman, the experts who managed the original Marshall Plan, inspired George W. Bush to suggest a similar commitment for Afghanistan in 2002. The United States just passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009 to help restart an economy torn by a financial war. Estonia, a former Soviet satellite, became the 17th member of the Eurozone on January 1, 2011. And the European Union has now grown to encompass 27 nations in all of Europe, united in diversity. After World War II, Europe was next to hopeless, its economy as dilapidated as its infrastructure. Crafted through steadfast debate and diplomacy, the Marshall Plan was the first ray of hope to permeate the European despair. It successfully rescued Western Europe's economy and ultimately helped make Europe the united continent it is today.